Tonight, let the weight of the modern world loosen its grip. The clocks, the screens, the urgency of now can rest for a while. You are safe here, moving slowly backward through layers of time that no longer demand anything from you. Imagine history not as a straight line, but as a quiet tide. Civilizations rise, fade, and leave behind traces like shells beneath the sand. Some are visible, others are felt only in absence. As you listen, allow curiosity to replace certainty. Not everything that mattered was remembered. Not everything remembered was the beginning. Somewhere beneath the stories we were taught, older memories are still breathing. Long before calendars, before borders, before the idea of history itself, human beings looked at the world and sensed that it was already old. The land felt worn, the stars familiar, the rivers patient beyond any single lifetime. When the first scribes pressed reeds into wet clay, they were not announcing a beginning. They were continuing something that had already been unfolding for longer than memory could easily hold. If this place feels familiar and you find yourself returning to it, you may wish to subscribe, not as a habit, but as a quiet promise to wander these forgotten timelines again whenever the present world feels too loud. The oldest written records we possess are often said to mark the dawn of civilization. Around 6,000 years ago, in the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia, symbols became language and memory became permanent. Names of kings, lengths of reigns, offerings to gods, measurements of grain. Yet within these first records lies an unsettling detail that history rarely lingers on. They do not speak like first attempts. They speak like continuations. They reference lineages, traditions, and events that already required explanation even then. The Sumerian king list is one such document. At first glance, it reads like a simple chronicle of rulers, but as the lines unfold, time stretches unnaturally. The earliest kings are said to have ruled for tens of thousands of years, not generations, not centuries, but spans so vast they dissolve our modern sense of possibility. Scholars often dismiss these reigns as symbolic or mythological, yet the scribes themselves made no distinction. To them, these were records, not stories. What makes this more intriguing is not the length of the reigns, but the structure of the memory. The list describes a clear dividing line. A great flood passes through the world, and afterward, kingship descends again from the heavens. But something has changed. Lifespans shorten, knowledge narrows, the world becomes smaller. This is not framed as the birth of civilization, but as its return after a catastrophic interruption. Similar patterns echo in other ancient cultures. In Egypt, pre-dynastic records hint at divine rulers who governed before the first pharaohs. In later texts, these early ages are treated with reverence and distance, as if they belong to a different order of reality. The Maya spoke of previous worlds, each ending in destruction before the current one took shape. These were not isolated myths, but recurring memories of loss. The question that emerges is quiet, but persistent. If the earliest records already describe a world rebuilt after catastrophe, then what existed before the rebuilding began? And why do so many cultures remember a time that history insists never happened? As we move deeper, the clay tablets and stone carvings begin to feel less like origins and more like survivors. Not the first words ever written, but the first words written after something immense was forgotten. What feels forgotten is often hidden in plain sight, carried forward not as explanation, but as assumption. The ancient scribes did not pause to justify why the world had once been different. They wrote as if their listeners already knew. This quiet confidence suggests a shared inheritance of memory, something absorbed long before words were fixed in clay or stone. To them, the past was not speculative. It was heavy, settled, and undeniable. In Mesopotamia, the idea of kingship descending from the heavens appears again and again, not metaphorically, but as a literal event. Authority was not invented by humans. It arrived. This belief shaped how early cities understood order, law, and responsibility. If rule came from above, then civilization itself was not a human experiment, but a continuation of an older design. Such an idea only makes sense if the people receiving it believed the world had already known higher forms of organization before their own time. The records also speak of watchers, teachers, and divine overseers who guided humanity through early ages. These beings are not introduced with drama. They are listed, named, and placed within administrative hierarchies. Tasks are assigned, functions are defined. This tone is strikingly practical. It reads less like myth-making and more like documentation, as if the scribes were preserving a structure that had once been visible and tangible. What unsettles modern readers is not the presence of gods, but the absence of wonder in how they are described. The texts do not ask whether these beings existed. They assume it. The real concern seems to be what happened when they withdrew, when guidance faded, when lifespans shortened, when humanity was left to manage a diminished world with fragments of inherited knowledge. Flood narratives deepen this sense of rupture. In Sumerian accounts, the flood is not merely a punishment, it is a reset, a correction. Something had grown unstable. The balance between worlds was lost. Afterward, survival depended not on rediscovery but on preservation. Lists, measurements, rituals, and laws became anchors, holding what remained of a much older order in place. Archaeology, too, whispers of discontinuity. Beneath some of the earliest known cities lie layers of silt, ash, and abandonment. Settlements appear, vanish, and reappear, sometimes with improved planning and technology, sometimes reduced and simplified. Progress does not move cleanly forward. It stutters, it restarts, it forgets. The most uncomfortable implication is subtle. If 6,000 years ago people were already remembering a time before disaster, then our definition of ancient may be incomplete. The first written records may not mark the birth of civilization, but the moment when survivors decided that forgetting again would be too dangerous. As these memories ripple outward across cultures and continents, a pattern begins to form. Not a single lost civilization, but a repeating cycle. Worlds rise, worlds fall, and each time those who remain try to warn the future, not with alarms, but with quiet records that assume someone, someday, will remember how to listen. Listening becomes harder the further we move from the source. Time does not erase evenly. It smooths sharp edges, softens certainty, and leaves behind shapes that feel symbolic only because their original context has dissolved. When later civilizations encountered these ancient records, they inherited fragments without the lived experience that once gave them weight. What was once memory slowly became myth, not because it was untrue, but because it no longer fit the scale of the present world. In Sumerian cosmology, the earliest age is described as a time when heaven and earth were closer, not physically, but functionally. Communication between realms was natural. Decisions flowed downward. Knowledge arrived fully formed, rather than being discovered through trial and error. Agriculture, mathematics, astronomy, and law appear suddenly in the archaeological record, as if recalled rather than invented. The speed of this emergence remains one of history's quiet anomalies. The 6,000-year mark becomes important not because it marks a beginning, but because it marks a boundary. Beyond it, the records thin, then vanish. Writing does not describe the first city ever built. It describes the first city rebuilt after memory loss. This distinction changes everything. It suggests that writing itself may have been an emergency response, a tool created to prevent total erasure after a collapse so complete that oral tradition alone could no longer carry what remained. Other cultures echo this fear of forgetting. In ancient Egypt, the concept of Zep-Tepi, the first time, refers to an age when gods ruled directly on earth. Temples were often described not as new constructions, but as restorations of older sacred plans. Even the Great Pyramid was said by later Egyptians to have existed before recorded dynasties, its origins already distant and uncertain. Sacred architecture became a way of locking memory into stone, resistant to floods, fire, and time. The same impulse appears in the Americas. Long before the Maya recorded their complex calendars, they spoke of earlier suns, previous ages that ended in destruction. Each world was complete in itself, populated, ordered, and then undone. The survivors did not celebrate their uniqueness. They mourned continuity. Their monuments align with the sky not as scientific achievements, but as reminders of cycles that repeat whether humanity remembers them or not. What unites these traditions is not catastrophe alone, but inheritance. Knowledge passes through resets like an echo, weaker each time, but still recognizable. Star positions, sacred numbers, mythic roles, and moral warnings recur across continents that official history insists never touched. This shared memory challenges the idea of isolated origins. It suggests a much older conversation, interrupted repeatedly, but never fully silenced. The 6,000-year records stand like a shoreline. On one side lies our familiar past. On the other, an ocean of time with no maps, only drifting fragments. Tablets, myths, ruins, and alignments become messages in bottles, sent forward by people who had already seen a world end. As we move further into these fragments, the question shifts. It is no longer whether an older world existed, but how many times it may have existed before, and how close we might be to forgetting again. Forgetting is rarely sudden. It arrives quietly, disguised as certainty. Each generation assumes the ground beneath it is solid, that the world it inherits is stable and permanent. Yet the ancient records suggest a different rhythm, one in which collapse is not an anomaly, but a phase. What feels unthinkable to us was familiar to them, woven into their understanding of time itself. In Mesopotamian thought, time was cyclical, not linear. Ages were measured not just in years, but in conditions: harmony, imbalance, correction, renewal. When the texts speak of God's withdrawing or the world growing noisy, they are not moralizing. They are describing systemic strain, a buildup that inevitably demands release. The flood, in this sense, becomes less a punishment and more a recalibration, a return to equilibrium through overwhelming force. The precision of ancient astronomical knowledge deepens this perspective. The ability to track planetary cycles, eclipses, and long celestial periods appears fully developed at the very start of recorded history. This is difficult to reconcile with the idea of gradual discovery. Such systems require long observation across many generations. The implication is quiet but profound. Someone had been watching the sky long before writing began. Stone structures across the world reinforce this idea. From the massive platforms of early Mesopotamia to the megalithic sites of Egypt and beyond, construction techniques emerged that seemed to carry inherited expertise. These were not experimental efforts. They were confident, deliberate, and often oriented with astonishing accuracy toward celestial events. Stone became a way of speaking to the future, immune to linguistic decay. The 6,000-year records rarely explain where this knowledge came from. They simply use it. Mathematics appears with base systems already optimized. Calendars align with solar and lunar cycles with little adjustment. Myths reference precise cosmic events hidden beneath poetic language. This suggests that what we call myth may be the residue of technical understanding preserved in narrative form when formal systems were lost. Even law codes reflect this inheritance. The earliest legal texts do not debate foundational principles. They codify them. Justice is presented as restoration of balance, not innovation. Kings are described as caretakers of an order that predates them. Their legitimacy rests not on conquest, but on alignment with something older and larger than human authority. As these elements converge, a pattern becomes harder to ignore. Civilization does not seem to begin at 6,000 years ago. It resumes. The records feel like instructions recovered from ruins, not blueprints drawn for the first time. Humanity appears as an heir, not an originator. This raises a final, unsettling possibility. If advanced knowledge survived previous collapses in fragments, then perhaps we too are living among inherited remnants without fully understanding their origin. And if so, the silence beyond the records may not mean emptiness, but the distance to the last forgotten world waiting beneath our own. Beneath our certainty lies an unease that ancient cultures seemed to accept without resistance. They did not assume permanence. Their monuments, myths, and measurements were shaped by the expectation of interruption. Survival was not just biological, it was informational. What mattered most was not expansion, but transmission across uncertain time. The 6,000-year records reveal this priority again and again. Lists, genealogies, star charts, ritual formulas. These were not casual traditions. They were safeguards. When destruction comes, complexity collapses first. What remains must be simple enough to endure, yet precise enough to rebuild from. This may explain why so much ancient knowledge appears encoded, compressed into symbolic language that could survive even when its original meaning was lost. Flood stories offer a particularly revealing lens. They appear across cultures separated by vast distances, yet they share structural details. A warning, a chosen survivor, preservation of life, knowledge, or both. Renewal after devastation. These narratives may not describe the same event, but they describe the same process. Repeated erasure followed by deliberate remembrance. Each flood becomes a marker, dividing one world from the next. Geology complicates the picture further. Earth's surface bears evidence of sudden climatic shifts, rapid sea level rise, and regional cataclysms that could have erased coastal civilizations without a trace. If earlier societies flourished near shorelines, as many do, their remains would now lie submerged, inaccessible, and silent. Absence of evidence becomes a fragile argument against existence. Even language itself carries hints of inheritance. Root words for sky, earth, law, and order echo across unrelated language families. This does not prove a single origin, but it suggests prolonged contact or shared conceptual frameworks long before official history allows. Ideas traveled, survived, and adapted even when the societies that formed them did not. The emotional tone of ancient records is telling. There is reverence, but also restraint, a sense of duty rather than triumph. The scribes do not celebrate progress. They record continuity. Their work feels urgent, as if they knew that memory decays faster than stone, and that forgetting is humanity's most reliable weakness. As modern readers, we often approach these texts looking for beginnings, but the more carefully we listen, the more they sound like aftermaths. The calm after a storm so complete that its violence no longer needed description. What mattered was what came next, and whether it would last longer this time. If an older world existed before ours, then its greatest legacy may not be technology or monuments, but warning. A quiet insistence that civilization is not a destination, but a fragile phase in a much longer story that has already been interrupted more times than we can easily imagine. Warnings are rarely explicit. They survive best when disguised as tradition, folded into ritual and routine so deeply that they no longer feel like alarms. Ancient societies seem to understand this instinctively. Instead of proclaiming catastrophe, they built calendars that tracked vast cycles, ceremonies that reenacted endings, and myths that normalized renewal through destruction. In doing so, they made collapse familiar, rather than paralyzing. The concept of ages, or world periods, appears almost everywhere once we begin to look for it. In India, the yugas describe descending phases of order and awareness. In Greece, ages of gold, silver, bronze, and iron unfold in steady decline. In Mesoamerica, Suns rise and fall, each with its own ending. These are not random stories. They are frameworks for understanding time as layered, repetitive, and indifferent to human ambition. What makes the 6,000-year records distinctive is their position within this cycle. They do not sit at the mythic beginning, nor at the prophetic end. They exist in the middle, at a point where memory is still intact enough to reference what came before, but already fragile enough to fear losing it again. This tension gives the texts their quiet intensity. The ancient obsession with alignment reflects this awareness. Cities were laid out according to the heavens. Temples mirrored constellations. Sacred days matched celestial events. To align with the cosmos was to remain legible to time itself. If the world were to reset, alignment might allow the future to recognize the past, to rediscover meaning encoded in orientation rather than language. Even numbers carry this burden of memory. Certain values repeat across cultures with striking consistency. 12, 60, 360. These are not arbitrary. They emerge from astronomical observation, from cycles far longer than a single lifetime. To preserve them was to preserve a connection to deep time, a reminder that humanity exists within rhythms it does not control. The deeper implication is subtle and unsettling. Ancient people may have understood that knowledge alone does not guarantee survival. Only knowledge that can be rediscovered does. This shifts the purpose of civilization from accumulation to resilience, from expansion to repetition, from progress to continuity. Seen through this lens, the 6,000-year threshold is not a starting line, but a checkpoint. A moment when humanity looked backward, assessed what had been lost, and tried carefully to build a world that might last just a little longer than the one before it. And as these efforts echo forward into our own time, the question that lingers is not whether they succeeded, but whether we have recognized the nature of the test we are still taking. Every test leaves traces, even when the answers are forgotten. In the ancient world, those traces were preserved in symbols that outlived their interpreters. Serpents, ladders, trees, mountains, floods. These images repeat so often that they begin to feel universal, yet their persistence suggests intention. They were chosen because they could survive translation, migration, and loss. The serpent in particular appears at the threshold between worlds. It guards knowledge, sheds its skin, renews itself. In Mesopotamia, it is linked to wisdom and immortality. In Mesoamerica, it becomes a feathered bridge between sky and earth. These are not identical stories, but they circle the same idea. Knowledge survives through transformation, not stasis. What cannot change cannot endure. Mountains and artificial hills serve a similar purpose. Ziggurats, pyramids, stepped platforms. Each is an attempt to recreate a stable center after chaos. Elevated ground resists floods. Height restores perspective. To build upward was to remember a world that had been flattened. These structures were not only places of worship, they were memories made physical. The 6,000-year records frequently emphasize restoration. Temples are rebuilt where older ones stood. Cities are founded on the ruins of earlier settlements. This was not convenience. It was continuity. To abandon a sacred site was to sever a line of memory that might never be reconnected. Even destruction did not erase significance. It reinforced it. What is striking is how rarely ancient texts express surprise at these cycles. The tone is sober, almost resigned. Catastrophe is expected. Recovery is the real challenge. The scribes seem less concerned with preventing collapse than with ensuring that something recognizable survives it. This attitude contrasts sharply with modern assumptions. We imagine ourselves at the peak of progress, insulated by technology and scale. Yet the ancient records suggest that scale itself can become a vulnerability. Larger systems fall harder. More complex networks fail more completely. Simpler forms endure. As we listen more closely to these early voices, they begin to sound less primitive and more cautious. They are not celebrating the dawn of civilization. They are navigating its aftermath. Their achievements are impressive precisely because they are restrained, shaped by the memory of loss rather than the thrill of invention. If an older world existed before ours, its disappearance may have taught a lesson that echoes through the 6,000-year records. That survival is not about reaching the highest point, but about leaving behind something stable enough to be found again when the waters recede. When the waters recede, what remains is never the world that was lost. It is a quieter landscape, stripped of excess, waiting to be named again. The 6,000-year records speak from this silence. They do not describe triumph over chaos, but coexistence with it. Civilization, in their view, is a temporary arrangement with forces far older and more patient than humanity. The earliest cities were built with this understanding. Their walls were thick, their layouts deliberate, their rituals repetitive. Repetition was not stagnation, it was memory rehearsed. Each festival reenacted creation, each offering renewed a fragile agreement between worlds. The goal was not novelty, but balance. The role of humanity in these texts is telling. Humans are not masters of the earth. They are caretakers, laborers, intermediaries. In Sumerian stories, people are created to maintain order, to relieve the gods of work, to keep the system functioning. This worldview places humanity inside a structure, not above it. Responsibility replaces dominance. This sense of placement may be the clearest inheritance from a previous world. A civilization that had already witnessed collapse would understand limits intimately. It would teach humility through story rather than command. It would frame existence as stewardship rather than conquest. As Act 1 draws to a close, the question that first stirred beneath the records grows sharper. If the earliest written history already carries the weight of endings, then our modern search for beginnings may be misplaced. What we call ancient may already be a recovery, not an origin. Beyond the 6,000-year horizon lies not darkness, but depth. A layered past where worlds rose, fell, and whispered forward through fragments. The tablets, the myths, the monuments, all of them point not backward to a single lost civilization, but downward into cycles that repeat regardless of belief. And as we move into the next act, the focus shifts from memory to structure, from what was lost to how the ancient cosmos was ordered. Because to understand what disappeared before us, we must first understand how the ancients believed the world was meant to function when it was whole. What was meant to function had a shape, a hierarchy that extended from the highest sky to the deepest soil. Ancient cosmologies were not abstract philosophies. They were operating maps of reality, explaining how forces interacted and where humanity stood within them. To lose this map was to risk repeating the same imbalance that had already ended a world. In Mesopotamia, the universe was layered, the heavens above, the earth between, the waters below. Each layer had its own inhabitants and laws, yet none existed in isolation. The gods moved between realms, maintaining order through presence rather than decree. When that presence weakened, disorder followed. This idea appears so consistently that it feels observational, not imaginative. The Anunnaki emerge within this structure not as distant deities, but as administrators of cosmic function. Their roles were defined. Some governed fertility, others justice, others the movement of celestial bodies. They were not omnipotent. They were responsible. This distinction matters. It implies a system that could fail if neglected or mismanaged. The Igigi, often described as lesser gods or workers, represent another layer of this hierarchy. Their eventual rebellion, recorded in ancient texts, is not framed as evil. It is exhaustion. Labor becomes unsustainable. Balance tips. The solution that follows is humanity itself. Humans are introduced as a corrective measure, created to carry the burden that destabilized the system. This narrative reads less like myth and more like memory filtered through symbolism. It describes a complex system under strain, responding through reorganization rather than annihilation. Humanity's origin becomes inseparable from crisis. We are born not at the dawn of harmony, but in its repair. The 6,000-year records preserve this story with remarkable consistency. They do not question the arrangement. They explain it. Rituals, laws, and social roles mirror the cosmic hierarchy. Kings rule as gods rule. Workers labor as lesser beings labored before. Order on earth reflects order in the sky. This mirroring suggests that ancient societies believed survival depended on alignment with this cosmic structure. To rebel against it was to invite collapse. To honor it was to extend stability a little longer. Civilization, then, was not an act of defiance against nature, but an attempt to cooperate with it. As we move deeper into this cosmology, the idea of an older world becomes less mysterious and more inevitable. If systems repeat, then worlds repeat. And if humanity was created as a solution once, it may not have been the first time balance required such an intervention. Intervention leaves traces, even when the event itself fades from memory. The creation of humanity in ancient texts carries a tone of practicality rather than wonder. There is no celebration of uniqueness, no declaration of supremacy. Humans are shaped with purpose, placed into an existing system to fulfill a specific role. This framing suggests continuity, not novelty. In Sumerian accounts, the materials of creation matter. Clay mixed with divine essence, earth combined with something older and more powerful. This blending implies inheritance. Humanity is not separate from what came before, but composed of it. Memory, labor, and responsibility are embedded into our origin story. The gods' need for rest is a recurring theme. It is easy to dismiss this as anthropomorphic storytelling, yet within the broader pattern it reads as systemic fatigue. Something had been operating for a long time. Maintenance became unsustainable. The introduction of humans is framed as optimization, a way to stabilize a system showing signs of strain. This perspective reframes the 6,000-year records yet again. They are not simply historical documents. They are manuals for continuity, instructions for how to keep the world functioning under new constraints. Agriculture, calendars, and law are not innovations. They are requirements. The flood, when it arrives, fits seamlessly into this logic. It is not an ending, but a recalibration. The world is cleansed of excess noise. Survivors are chosen not for virtue, but for reliability. They are tasked with restarting the system, preserving measurements, rituals, and boundaries. The emphasis is always on restoration. What is striking is how little emotional language is used. There is grief, but no panic. Acceptance rather than terror. This emotional restraint suggests familiarity. A civilization that had already endured collapse would record it differently than one encountering it for the first time. As the cosmological framework becomes clearer, the idea of a single lost civilization gives way to something broader. Multiple worlds, each shaped by the same underlying structure, each ending when balance was lost, each leaving behind fragments for the next to inherit. The 6,000-year records sit at a hinge point in this long sequence. They look backward with awareness and forward with caution. They do not promise permanence. They offer guidance, and in doing so, they quietly imply that our world, too, is part of this same structure. Not the final version, but one more iteration moving through an ancient, repeating design that does not end with us. Guidance only matters if it is recognized. Ancient societies embedded their instructions into daily life, ensuring that memory did not depend on belief alone. Agriculture followed celestial timing. Law echoed cosmic order. Architecture mirrored the heavens. By living inside the pattern, people became participants in preservation rather than passive inheritors. This integration explains the sudden coherence of early civilizations. Cities did not emerge as chaotic clusters. They followed plans. Streets aligned, temples occupied symbolic centers, even domestic spaces reflected a hierarchy of function. This was not merely social organization, it was cosmology made habitable. The 6,000-year records reveal anxiety beneath this order, not fear of the gods, but fear of misalignment. A king who ruled unjustly risked more than rebellion. He threatened balance. Droughts, floods, and disease were interpreted as feedback, signals that the system was drifting off course. Correction became a moral and practical necessity. This worldview blurs the boundary between myth and science. Observation and ritual are intertwined. Astronomical events are tracked with care not out of curiosity, but out of survival. To miss a cycle was to risk repeating a catastrophe whose details had already faded, but whose consequences were remembered. The longevity of this system is remarkable. For thousands of years, variations of the same cosmic structure appear across cultures. Names change, symbols evolve, but the underlying logic persists. This continuity suggests that the framework itself was inherited, passed forward because it worked. If an older world existed, it may have refined this structure through trial and error. Collapse would not erase the framework entirely. It would distill it. Each reset would leave behind a simpler, more resilient version, capable of surviving with fewer resources and less certainty. This process of distillation may explain why ancient knowledge often appears more sophisticated than expected, yet limited in scope. It is not incomplete discovery. It is selective survival. What endured was what could be remembered, taught, and rebuilt without infrastructure. As we move further into these patterns, the 6,000-year records begin to feel less like ancient curiosities and more like messages addressed to us directly. They do not warn with urgency. They instruct with patience, and the instruction is subtle but consistent. Pay attention to balance. Honor cycles. Remember that order is temporary, and forgetting how it was maintained is the fastest way to lose it again. Patience is the language of deep time. The ancient records do not rush toward conclusions. They circle, repeat, reinforce. This rhythm mirrors the cycles they describe. Knowledge is not meant to be consumed quickly. It is meant to settle, to become instinct, so that when crisis arrives, response does not depend on debate. The role of memory becomes central here. Not personal memory, but cultural memory. A shared understanding of what happens when balance is ignored. The 6,000-year records function as anchors, holding civilizations steady against the current of forgetting. They are deliberately conservative, favoring repetition over innovation. This conservatism is often misunderstood. Modern perspectives interpret it as stagnation or superstition, but within the ancient framework, change was dangerous. Too much deviation risked destabilizing systems whose limits were already known through loss. Stability was not complacency, it was survival. The myths of rebellion among the gods reflect this caution. When lesser beings resist their roles, the system strains. When authority is misused, correction follows. These stories do not glorify rebellion. They contextualize it as a warning. Disorder has consequences that extend far beyond the individual. Even the concept of evil is treated differently. It is not an external force, but imbalance itself. Too much noise, too much extraction, too much ambition. The solution is rarely destruction of an enemy. It is restoration of measure. This worldview offers insight into why ancient civilizations invested so heavily in continuity. Education was memorization. Art followed strict conventions. Innovation was incremental and controlled. The goal was not to surpass the past, but to remain aligned with it. If earlier worlds had fallen due to excess or miscalculation, then restraint would become the highest virtue. The 6,000-year records preserve this lesson quietly, without accusation. They do not say what destroyed the older world. They show how to avoid doing it again. As Act 2 continues, the cosmological order grows more detailed, revealing a universe that is responsive, interconnected, and fragile. Humanity's place within it is neither central nor insignificant. It is conditional. And as these conditions unfold, the older world begins to feel less like a mystery buried in the past and more like a mirror held up to the present, reflecting possibilities we may not yet be ready to recognize. Mirrors do not show the future, but they reveal patterns. The ancient world watched those patterns closely, especially in the sky. Celestial motion was the most reliable expression of order they knew. Stars returned. Planets wandered but obeyed rhythm. Eclipses came and went. Against this consistency, earthly chaos stood out sharply. The 6,000-year records contain star lists, planetary tables, and calendars that reach far beyond immediate utility. They track long cycles that no single observer could witness in a lifetime. This implies continuity of observation across generations, and perhaps across worlds. Someone had already learned what was worth watching. Astronomy in these cultures was inseparable from destiny. Not in the sense of personal fate, but collective timing. When to plant, when to build, when to rest, when to prepare. Celestial events marked windows of stability and risk. To ignore them was to invite disorder. This deep attention to the sky reinforces the idea that catastrophe was not random. It was cyclical, predictable, at least in part. Floods, climate shifts, and cosmic disturbances may have followed patterns now forgotten. The older world may have known these rhythms more clearly, and the 6,000-year records preserve their echoes. Architecture becomes a form of astronomical memory. Alignments encode dates. Shadows mark solstices. Stone fixes knowledge in place, allowing it to survive even when language fails. These structures do not explain themselves. They wait. Waiting implies confidence, a belief that someone, someday, would stand in the same place, notice the same alignment, and feel the same question rise. This is not the mindset of a civilization at its beginning. It is the mindset of one aware of interruption. The gods associated with the sky are often depicted as distant, slow, and impartial. They do not intervene constantly. They maintain cycles. This portrayal suggests an understanding that ultimate forces operate on timescales beyond human emotion. Alignment, not appeal, is the only response that matters. As we move through these celestial frameworks, the idea of an older world gains clarity. It was not necessarily more advanced in every way. It was more attuned. It listened longer. It watched patterns we have largely stopped observing. And in the quiet persistence of those patterns, preserved across 6,000 years of record, there is a suggestion that the sky remembers even when the earth forgets, and that the next reset, like the last, will follow a rhythm older than our names for it. Older than names are the intervals between them, the spaces where memory thins and continuity is tested. Ancient cultures sensed these intervals and treated them with reverence. Thresholds mattered. Transitions between ages, reigns, and cycles were marked carefully, as if acknowledging the fragility of passage itself. The 6,000-year records frequently reference beginnings that are not absolute. Kingship begins again. Cities are founded anew. Order is restored. This language implies prior attempts, a rhythm of loss and recovery rather than a single ascent. Each restoration carries humility, an awareness that what is rebuilt may also fall. This humility shapes how knowledge is presented. There is little speculation about origins. The texts are pragmatic, focused on maintenance, how to measure land, how to track time, how to appease forces beyond control. The past is not romanticized. It is instructive. What remains largely unspoken is how much was lost. The gaps in the records are as telling as the words themselves. Sudden shifts in style, unexplained resets in genealogy, abrupt changes in settlement patterns. These silences hint at events too large or too painful to narrate directly. In this context, the older world becomes less a single civilization and more a series of remembered absences. Each culture inherits fragments and fills the gaps with symbols. Floods, fires, darkness, and silence stand in for experiences no longer fully accessible. The emotional restraint of these records suggests endurance rather than ignorance. People who have survived collapse do not dwell on spectacle. They focus on what must be done next. Their calm is not denial. It is discipline. This discipline extends to how humanity views itself. There is no claim of finality, no assertion that this world is the last or best. The ancients lived with the possibility of repetition. Their myths and measurements keep that possibility visible. As Act 2 approaches its midpoint, the cosmological order feels complete yet precarious. The system works, but only under care. Balance must be actively maintained. Memory must be renewed. And in this careful attention, the 6,000-year records continue to whisper the same message across time. The world has been older before. It has ended before. And what survives is not certainty, but the willingness to remember that endings are part of the design. Design implies intention, but not permanence. The ancient cosmos was not built to last forever. It was built to function for a time. This acceptance runs quietly beneath the 6,000-year records, shaping their tone and priorities. Stability is treated as temporary, something to be honored while it exists, rather than assumed as a right. The gods themselves are bound by this design. They age, they tire, they argue, they withdraw. These qualities are not flaws. They are acknowledgments of limits. Power does not eliminate entropy. It manages it briefly. This perspective reframes divine conflict. When the texts describe cosmic struggle, it is not good versus evil. It is order versus overload, systems reaching capacity, forces exceeding thresholds. Resolution comes not through victory, but through reset. Humanity's role within this design remains consistent. We are not saviors. We are stabilizers. Our labor, rituals, and laws act as pressure valves, releasing imbalance before it accumulates beyond control. This is why neglect is portrayed as dangerous. Forgetting our function invites collapse. The 6,000-year records emphasize duty over destiny. Kings are judged not by conquest but by stewardship. Priests are measured by precision, not charisma. Farmers follow calendars not for profit but for survival. Everyone has a place. Everyone carries weight. This worldview may feel restrictive to modern sensibilities, yet it reflects an awareness we have largely lost. Freedom without limits destabilizes systems faster than oppression. The ancients understood constraint as a form of care. If an older world existed, its failure likely taught this lesson deeply. Excess, expansion, and imbalance would have left scars that memory alone could not erase. Those scars shaped the cautious, ordered societies that followed. As we move closer to the end of Act 2, the question shifts again. It is no longer what existed before us, but why it could not last. The answer does not lie in a single event, but in accumulated strain. And as the records suggest, strain is invisible until it is not. By the time collapse arrives, it feels sudden, even though it has been building for generations beneath the quiet routines meant to prevent it. Strain reveals itself first in subtle ways. A calendar slips, a ritual is shortened, measurements vary slightly from one region to another. At first, these differences seem harmless, even natural, but in a system built on alignment, small deviations accumulate. The 6,000-year records hint at this process without naming it directly. Texts begin to emphasize correction. Edicts reinforce tradition. Myths remind listeners of consequences. There is a sense of tightening, as if society is pulling inward to stabilize itself. This is not paranoia. It is response. The memory of collapse sharpens attention to imbalance. The gods in these moments become less present, not because they have abandoned the world, but because the system is drifting beyond easy adjustment. Divine withdrawal is not punishment. It is distance created by misalignment. When communication falters, uncertainty grows. Flood narratives often appear at this stage. Not always literal floods, but symbols of overwhelming correction. Water erases distinctions. It resets boundaries. In a world stretched too far, water becomes the great equalizer. The repetition of this motif across cultures suggests a shared understanding of how systems fail when pressure exceeds capacity. Archaeological layers support this quiet warning. Periods of prosperity are followed by sudden abandonment. Cities empty, trade networks collapse, skills are lost. What remains is simpler, smaller, more cautious. Recovery does not restore what was lost. It adapts to what remains. The 6,000-year records sit just beyond such a contraction. They speak from a world that has already narrowed its expectations. Grandeur gives way to order. Ambition yields to preservation. The lesson has been learned, even if its origin is no longer fully remembered. As Act 2 begins to turn toward catastrophe, the tone of the narrative deepens. Balance has been maintained for a time, but strain continues beneath the surface. Cycles move forward whether humanity is ready or not. And in this slow, inevitable motion, the older world that once existed before ours begins to feel less like a distant mystery and more like a familiar shadow cast by the same forces now quietly shaping the edges of our own. Shadows lengthen before collapse, even when the sun still shines. The 6,000-year records carry this awareness in their silences. Certain names disappear from lists, reigns shorten abruptly, genealogies compress. Time itself seems to accelerate, as if history is trying to move past something it cannot hold. In Mesopotamian texts, the later ages show a narrowing of possibility. Where once gods walked openly among humans, now they are distant. Where knowledge was broad, it becomes specialized. Where cities were expansive, they contract behind thicker walls. These are not signs of progress or decline alone. They are adaptations to pressure. The idea of divine judgment emerges more strongly during these periods. Yet judgment here is not moral outrage. It is consequence. When balance is lost, correction follows. This framing removes blame and replaces it with inevitability. Collapse is not caused by evil intent, but by accumulated misalignment. The flood stands as the ultimate expression of this correction, not sudden, not arbitrary, but decisive. It wipes away excess complexity, leaving only what can float, what can be carried forward. Survival depends not on power, but on preparation and restraint. The survivors in these stories are rarely heroic. They are careful, they listen, they follow instructions. This emphasis suggests that by the time catastrophe arrives, resistance is futile. Only alignment remains effective. After the flood, the world is quieter. Gods retreat further. Lifespans shorten dramatically. Humanity inherits more responsibility with fewer guides. This transition marks a permanent change. The world after catastrophe is not meant to mirror the one before. It is a reduced version, designed to function under new limitations. The 6,000-year records preserve this post-collapse reality. They do not promise a return to former greatness. They accept a smaller horizon. Memory becomes fragmented, focused on essentials rather than completeness. As Act 2 nears its end, the cosmological order begins to fray, not through dramatic rebellion, but through gradual withdrawal. The system that once supported an older world can no longer sustain its complexity. And in this retreat, the question that lingers is not why the older world ended, but whether any world built on such fragile balance can ever avoid the same quiet unraveling when the cycle turns again. When unraveling reaches its limit, it no longer announces itself. It simply happens. The 6,000-year records treat this moment with remarkable restraint. There is no extended description of terror, no indulgence in chaos. Instead, the focus shifts immediately to aftermath. What survived? What was preserved? What must now be done? This narrative choice is revealing. It suggests that the ending of the older world was not a singular shock, but the culmination of a long process already understood. By the time catastrophe arrived, it confirmed what had been sensed for generations. The real work began afterward. Post-collapse texts emphasize re-establishment. Boundaries are redrawn. Calendars are reset. Laws are reissued. This repetition is not redundancy. It is necessity. Without redefinition, society dissolves. Order must be named again to exist. The god's presence diminishes further in these later accounts. Communication becomes indirect, mediated through signs, dreams, and omens. Humanity is left with fewer certainties and greater responsibility. This shift marks the transition into the world we recognize as historical. The 6,000-year threshold becomes visible here. Writing appears not as an innovation of abundance, but as a response to fragility. Memory can no longer rely on continuity of culture alone. It must be fixed, externalized, protected from loss. Clay tablets, stone inscriptions, and monumental architecture serve this function. They are not expressions of confidence. They are acts of caution. Each mark pressed into clay is an acknowledgement that memory is failing, that what was once known instinctively must now be recorded deliberately. This is why the earliest records feel so composed. They are not experimental. They are urgent. There is little room for error. What is written must endure because it may be all that remains. As Act 2 concludes, the cosmological order that once supported an older world stands reduced but intact. Enough structure survives to rebuild, but not enough to restore what was lost. And in this fragile continuity, the 6,000-year records quietly confirm their most unsettling implication. Our civilization did not begin at the dawn of order. It emerged in the long shadow of an ending that had already taught humanity how easily worlds can disappear. Shadows stretch far beyond the moment that casts them. In the aftermath preserved by the 6,000-year records, life resumes, but it does so with caution embedded into every structure. The world that follows catastrophe is narrower, quieter, and more watchful. Ambition is tempered by memory, even when that memory is incomplete. The earliest historical societies inherit not confidence, but restraint. Cities grow slowly, borders are respected, innovation is guided by precedent. The past is treated as authority, not nostalgia. This posture suggests a collective awareness that excess once led to loss, even if the details of that loss were no longer fully accessible. The gods, now distant, become symbols rather than companions. Their stories are retold not to invoke presence, but to preserve orientation. Myths explain why the world is limited, why human lives are shorter, why knowledge must be earned rather than received. These narratives normalize reduction, making it bearable. The 6,000-year records also reveal a shift in how time is perceived. Long ages give way to dynasties. Immense reigns compress into human-scale lifespans. History becomes countable. This contraction of time reflects a contraction of possibility. The infinite has withdrawn, leaving humanity to manage what remains. Yet even in this reduced state, echoes persist. Certain numbers, alignments, and rituals remain unchanged. These are the bones of the older world carried forward because they still function. They are not fully understood, but they are trusted. Survival depends on respecting patterns whose origins are obscured by distance. This trust is fragile. As generations pass, reverence can fade into routine. What was once precaution becomes habit. The 6,000-year records stand at the beginning of this process, capturing a moment when memory was still sharp enough to influence behavior directly. As we approach the transition into the next act, the narrative prepares to shift again. The question is no longer how the older world ended, but how its fragments were interpreted, misunderstood, and transformed over time. Because what survives catastrophe is never preserved unchanged. It is filtered through belief, fear, and hope. And in those filters, the seeds of both continuity and future collapse are quietly planted. Seeds do not choose the soil they fall into. They adapt or they vanish. The fragments of the older world preserved in the 6,000-year records entered new contexts, shaped by cultures that no longer shared the same lived memory of collapse. What had once been instruction gradually became tradition, then symbol, then story. This transformation was inevitable. Without direct experience, meaning thins. Rituals are performed because they are inherited, not because their original function is understood. Alignments remain precise, but their purpose becomes sacred rather than practical. Myth replaces memory, not as deception, but as survival. The danger of this shift is subtle. When symbols are preserved without understanding, they can be reinterpreted freely. The same story that once warned against excess can be used to justify dominance. The same hierarchy meant to maintain balance can become a tool of control. The system continues, but its intent drifts. The 6,000-year records mark the last moment when fragments of the older world were still close enough to be recognized as such. After this point, reinterpretation accelerates. Gods become abstractions. Cycles become allegory. Catastrophe becomes moral lesson rather than systemic warning. This does not mean the knowledge is lost entirely. It changes form. It hides in architecture, numbers, and recurring motifs. It waits for conditions that allow it to be seen again. But it no longer guides daily life with the same clarity. As Act 2 closes, the cosmological order that once framed reality begins to dissolve into belief systems rather than operational maps. Humanity moves further from direct alignment and closer to assumption. The 6,000-year records remain as a quiet boundary. On one side, memory still functions as memory. On the other, memory becomes narrative. And it is within that narrative space that future civilizations will search for meaning, unaware that beneath their stories lie instructions left behind by a world that already learned, the hard way, what happens when balance is forgotten. When narrative replaces instruction, catastrophe becomes harder to recognize. It no longer appears as a systemic failure, but as a moral drama. Heroes and villains emerge. Blame is assigned. The deeper patterns that once guided survival fade into the background. This is the threshold where the older world truly disappears, not through destruction, but through reinterpretation. The 6,000-year records stand just before this shift becomes irreversible. After them, memory fragments scatter into competing traditions. Each culture carries a piece, but no single one holds the whole. The warnings remain, but they are no longer synchronized. This fragmentation shapes how catastrophe is remembered. Floods become divine punishment. Fire becomes wrath. Darkness becomes sin. These explanations are emotionally satisfying, but they obscure the mechanics of collapse. The lesson changes from balance to obedience. Yet the older framework does not vanish entirely. It resurfaces in unexpected places, in cyclical calendars that outlast empires, in sacred mountains rebuilt again and again, in myths that insist the world has ended before and will end again. These are echoes of a system that once functioned coherently. Archaeological evidence supports this layered memory. Sites show repeated destruction and reconstruction over vast timescales. Each layer carries a different interpretation of the same space. Meaning accumulates even as understanding erodes. This is the beginning of Act 3. Catastrophe is no longer a singular event in the distant past. It becomes a recurring presence, shaping civilizations that no longer remember why their ancestors were so careful. The older world is now fully lost as a lived reality, but not as influence. It exerts pressure from below, like a buried structure shaping the ground above it. Societies rise on foundations they do not recognize. As we move forward, the focus turns to the moments when these buried pressures break through the surface. When floods, fires, and collapses occur not as myths, but as historical events. Because even when memory fades, cycles do not stop. and the world continues to test whether humanity can recognize the signs of strain without the clarity its ancestors once possessed. Historical catastrophes do not arrive as echoes of myth. They arrive as lived confusion. Crops fail, rivers behave strangely, seasons drift. Records from early civilizations begin to note these disruptions with increasing frequency, not as omens at first, but as irregularities, small deviations that accumulate into crisis. The 6,000-year records had warned of such strain, but later societies no longer read them as instructions. They read them as sacred history. When imbalance returned, the response shifted from correction to supplication. Instead of adjusting systems, people pleaded with symbols. Floods recorded in later periods differ in tone from earlier accounts. They are sudden, localized, devastating. Survivors struggle to explain them. Without the older framework, catastrophe feels personal. It targets cities, kingdoms, dynasties. Meaning becomes fragmented, just as memory had. Archaeology confirms this confusion. Layers of destruction appear without corresponding adaptation. Cities are rebuilt in the same vulnerable locations. Trade networks resume unchanged. The lesson is not integrated. Collapse becomes episodic rather than transformative. This marks a critical change from the older world. Earlier resets resulted in simplification and restraint. Later collapses are followed by repetition. The same patterns return, suggesting that the deeper warning has been lost. Yet even in this diminished understanding, traces of the ancient cycle persist. Calendars are adjusted after disasters. New eras are declared. Kings claim renewal. These gestures echo older practices, stripped of their original depth but still reaching toward alignment. The emotional weight of catastrophe also changes. Fear replaces acceptance. Hope replaces preparation. Civilization begins to gamble on permanence rather than plan for interruption. This gamble defines much of recorded history. As Act 3 unfolds, catastrophe becomes more frequent, not necessarily because the world has changed, but because humanity's relationship to cycles has weakened. Without memory as guide, each collapse feels unprecedented. And in this repetition without understanding, the silence of the older world grows louder, pressing against history with the same question it has always asked. What happens when a civilization no longer remembers why it once feared excess? Excess rarely announces itself as danger. It presents as success. Growth feels like validation. Expansion feels like destiny. In the eras that follow the 6,000-year records, civilizations begin to equate stability with scale. Larger cities, greater harvests, longer trade routes. The assumption quietly takes hold that what has been achieved can be sustained indefinitely. The older world had known otherwise. Its memory lingered as myth, but its discipline was gone. Without restraint embedded in structure, complexity accelerates faster than understanding. Systems grow intricate, interdependent, and fragile. When failure comes, it no longer resets gently. It fractures violently. Historical floods, droughts, and collapses now appear less like corrections and more like shocks. The response is reactive. Emergency measures replace long preparation. Each recovery attempts to restore what was lost rather than adapt to new limits. This difference is subtle but decisive. The 6,000-year records had treated catastrophe as a narrowing of possibility. Later histories treat it as interruption. The goal becomes restoration of former greatness, not acceptance of reduction. This mindset ensures that strain returns quickly, often amplified. Evidence of this can be seen in repeated abandonment of cities that were rebuilt multiple times in the same locations. Each iteration grows more complex, more dependent on centralized control, and less resilient to disruption. When collapse comes again, it is deeper. The gods of these later periods reflect this shift. They become more demanding, more moralizing, more volatile. This volatility mirrors human anxiety. When systems feel unstable, divinity is asked to compensate. Responsibility moves upward instead of inward. Yet beneath this surface confusion, the ancient pattern remains. Catastrophe continues to arrive in cycles. Collapse continues to simplify. Survivors continue to preserve fragments, even when they no longer understand their origin. As Act 3 progresses, the contrast sharpens between the older world that anticipated endings and the later worlds that denied them. One prepared to endure, the other hoped to escape. And in that hope, repeated again and again across history, lies the quiet tragedy the 6,000-year records tried to prevent. A forgetting not just of events, but of the rhythm that makes them inevitable. Inevitability becomes invisible when it is stretched across generations. No single lifetime feels responsible for the outcome, so responsibility dissolves into abstraction. This is the condition under which later civilizations operated, separated from the older world by time, but still bound to its cycles. The 6,000-year records had existed as anchors, but their meaning faded as confidence grew. Writing expanded. Bureaucracy replaced ritual. Knowledge multiplied, yet coherence weakened. Information increased faster than wisdom, and the balance the ancients once guarded so carefully began to drift again. When collapse returns under these conditions, it is harsher. Without shared understanding of reduction, societies resist simplification. They cling to complexity even as it fails. Infrastructure decays. Authority fractures. Violence fills the gaps where coordination once existed. The reset is no longer orderly. It is chaotic. Historical dark ages reflect this pattern. Not total collapse, but severe contraction. Skills vanish. Literacy declines. Trade shrinks. What survives does so unevenly. Pockets of knowledge persist while others disappear entirely. The result is not a clean slate, but a distorted inheritance. This distortion shapes the future. The fragments that endure are treated as complete truths rather than partial survivors. Myths harden into doctrine. Symbols become literal. The flexibility that once allowed civilizations to adapt is replaced by rigidity meant to preserve identity at all costs. Yet even here, the older world leaves its imprint. The impulse to rebuild calendars, to restore sacred centers, to mark new eras after disaster continues. Humanity cannot escape the instinct to reestablish order, even when it no longer knows how that order once functioned. As Act 3 deepens, catastrophe and recovery blur into a repeating rhythm. Collapse is no longer extraordinary. It becomes a background condition of history. Empires rise knowing, at some level, that they will fall. The 6,000-year records remain distinct because they sit at the last moment when this cycle was consciously acknowledged. After them, humanity continues the pattern without understanding it. And it is this loss of awareness, more than any single disaster, that ensures the cycle will repeat again, reshaping the world long after the names of its builders have faded into silence. Silence follows every reshaping, not empty silence, but the quiet of reduced expectation. After collapse, societies do not immediately question what was lost. They focus on what remains: shelter, food, safety, meaning contracts to fit survival. Only later does curiosity return, probing the ruins for explanation. The 6,000-year records describe a moment when explanation still mattered. Later worlds inherit aftermath without context. Ruins become wonders. Precision becomes mystery. The older world, once understood as a system, is now perceived as impossibility. This shift gives rise to speculation. Giants, gods, golden ages. When the mechanics of the past are forgotten, imagination fills the gap. The same structures once built with restraint are now attributed to excess power. The lesson in balance is replaced by fascination with dominance. Archaeology reveals this misreading clearly. Sites built with practical alignment and function are later reused symbolically, meaning changes even when stone remains unmoved. Each new culture projects its own assumptions onto the same foundations. The danger here is subtle. When the past is mythologized, it loses its capacity to instruct. Awe replaces understanding. The older world becomes something to admire, not something to learn from. This transformation marks a final layer of forgetting, yet fragments still resist erasure, measurements that still work, alignments that still mark time, agricultural practices that still follow ancient cycles. These survivals are not accidental. They persist because they remain useful even when their origin is obscured. As Act 3 approaches its final descent, catastrophe is no longer framed as correction or failure. It becomes fate, something that happens to civilizations rather than something civilizations participate in creating. The 6,000-year records had offered a different view. Collapse was relational. It emerged from imbalance between systems and limits. To forget this is to surrender agency, and in that surrender, humanity steps fully into the repeating cycle, no longer as a careful steward of continuity, but as a witness to endings it no longer knows how to interpret. Witnessing without understanding creates a particular kind of fear. It is quieter than panic, heavier than grief. It settles into culture as resignation. Civilizations begin to assume that collapse is unavoidable, but they no longer ask why. This acceptance marks a profound shift from the worldview preserved in the 6,000-year records. In the older framework, inevitability did not excuse inaction. Cycles were respected precisely because they could be navigated. Timing mattered. Preparation mattered. Reduction was not defeat, but strategy. Later worlds lose this nuance. They know endings come, but they do not know how to meet them. This loss reshapes ambition. Instead of building for endurance, societies build for memory. Monuments grow larger. Declarations become grander. The hope is not survival through collapse, but remembrance after it. Legacy replaces continuity. The archaeological record reflects this change. Late-stage civilizations invest heavily in symbolic architecture while neglecting infrastructure. Temples expand as water systems decay. Palaces rise as soil erodes. Appearance begins to outweigh function. This imbalance accelerates failure. The 6,000-year records would have recognized this pattern immediately. They treat function as sacred. Symbol without stability is meaningless. When ritual loses its operational grounding, it becomes decoration. As pressure increases, belief systems harden. Certainty becomes defensive. Alternative interpretations are suppressed. Flexibility, once a tool of survival, is now seen as threat. This rigidity ensures that when collapse comes, adaptation is slow and costly. Yet even in this constrained state, echoes of the older world persist. Warnings resurface in apocalyptic myths. Cycles are reimagined as final judgments. The sense that the world has ended before refuses to disappear, even when stripped of its original context. As Act 3 nears its end, catastrophe looms not as surprise, but as culmination. The system has reached saturation. Complexity has outpaced resilience. Memory has thinned beyond usefulness. And in this moment, the silence left by the older world becomes almost audible, not as accusation, but as absence, a space where understanding once lived, waiting to be rediscovered by those willing to look past myth and listen for pattern. Rediscovery rarely happens at the height of collapse. It waits for stillness. After systems fail and noise subsides, fragments become visible again. Stones align, numbers repeat, stories echo across cultures that should not share them. In these moments, the older world begins to reappear, not as a place, but as a pattern. The 6,000-year records function as the earliest surviving expression of this pattern. Later generations approach them as artifacts, but beneath their surface lies a consistent logic. When stripped of embellishment, the message is simple. Civilization is cyclical. Balance is temporary. Memory is survival. Catastrophes recorded in later history can be reinterpreted through this lens. Floods are not just disasters. They are thresholds. Dark ages are not failures. They are contractions. What matters is not avoiding these phases, but navigating them. This reframing restores agency. Humanity is not powerless before cycles. It can choose how to meet them. Preparation does not prevent collapse, but it shapes what comes after. This was the core lesson of the older world. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests that some groups remembered this better than others. Isolated communities, monastic traditions, and indigenous cultures often preserved cyclical awareness long after empires forgot it. Their survival strategies emphasize adaptability, restraint, and reverence for limits. As Act 3 closes, the narrative completes its descent into catastrophe and recovery. The older world is no longer a lost civilization behind us. It is a framework beneath us, shaping every rise and fall. The 6,000-year records do not demand belief. They invite recognition. They ask us to see history not as a march forward, but as a series of returns, each offering the same test in different conditions. And as we move into the next act, interpretation replaces event. The question becomes how modern minds have tried to reconcile these patterns, and what theories have emerged to explain the persistence of memory across cycles that seem to erase everything else. Recognition is the quiet beginning of responsibility. Once a pattern is seen, it cannot be unseen. The 6,000-year records stand at the threshold of this awareness, offering just enough clarity to suggest that history's deepest movements are not random, but rhythmic. The catastrophes that follow across recorded time no longer appear isolated when viewed through this lens. They align with environmental shifts, astronomical cycles, and periods of rapid complexity. Floods coincide with melting ice. Droughts follow climatic instability. Civilizations crest and break like waves, driven by forces both external and internal. The older world may not have named these forces scientifically, but it observed their effects carefully. Its language was symbolic because symbolism travels further than precision when memory is threatened. What mattered was not explanation but survival through recognition. This perspective reshapes how we read ancient texts. What once seemed fantastical becomes practical. Long reigns suggest long cycles. Divine intervention suggests environmental correction. Myth becomes compressed data, encoded to survive loss. As Act 3 ends, the narrative leaves catastrophe behind and turns fully toward interpretation. Modern thinkers, ancient astronomers, and speculative theories converge around the same unsettling intuition that humanity has been here before, not as individuals, but as a pattern of behavior responding to repeating conditions. The 6,000-year records are no longer proof in the conventional sense. They are signals. They do not point to a single lost civilization, but to an inherited rhythm that keeps resurfacing whenever the world is pushed beyond balance. And in this transition, the story releases us from the need to find a final answer. Instead, it prepares us to ask better questions. Not what was lost, but what was remembered. Not how it ended, but how it returned. As we step into the next act, theory replaces chronicle, and the search for meaning shifts from ruins in the ground to cycles written into the sky, the earth, and the human instinct to rebuild again and again. Theory begins where certainty ends. Once the idea of a single linear history loosens, space opens for reinterpretation. The 6,000-year records become reference points rather than conclusions, anchors around which modern and ancient thought begins to orbit. Some interpretations remain symbolic. The older world is seen as a psychological age, a mythic memory of innocence or unity. In this view, floods represent collective trauma, and gods represent aspects of consciousness. These readings offer insight, but they leave unanswered why so many cultures preserve the same structures, numbers, and cycles with such precision. Other interpretations turn toward the literal. They ask whether the ancient world remembered real events, not allegorically, but experientially. Rapid climate shifts, sudden sea level rise, cosmic impacts. These possibilities no longer belong solely to speculation. Geology and astronomy increasingly confirm that Earth's history includes abrupt resets, capable of erasing entire civilizations. The idea of lost civilizations becomes plausible not because of advanced technology, but because of geography. If earlier societies thrived along ancient coastlines, their remains would now lie beneath rising seas. Absence of evidence becomes expected rather than suspicious. The 6,000-year threshold gains new meaning here. It may mark not the birth of civilization, but the stabilization of climate after upheaval. Writing appears when survival allows reflection. Memory is recorded when life becomes predictable again. Some theories extend further, proposing repeating astronomical cycles that influence Earth over vast timescales. Long celestial periods, invisible within a single lifetime, could align with recurring catastrophe. The ancients, attentive to the sky, may have recognized these rhythms long before modern instruments could confirm them. What unites these theories is not agreement, but convergence. Different disciplines arrive at the same intuition from different directions. That humanity's story is not singular, and that memory, however fragmented, has been trying to say so all along. As Act 4 unfolds, interpretation becomes a bridge between ancient record and modern understanding. The older world no longer feels unreachable. It becomes a hypothesis written into myth, stone, and silence, waiting for minds willing to read across boundaries rather than within them. Across these boundaries, certain ideas reappear with striking persistence. One is the notion of long cycles governed by the sky. Ancient astronomy did not limit itself to seasons and years. It tracked precession, planetary returns, and deep rhythms that unfold over thousands of years. These cycles were not curiosities. They were warnings. The 6,000-year records preserve the afterimage of this knowledge. Calendars align with solar and lunar harmonics that extend far beyond immediate need. Numbers such as 60 and 360 recur because they mirror celestial movement. This mathematical consistency suggests inherited understanding rather than coincidental discovery. Speculative theories often focus on a missing celestial actor, a wandering body, a distant companion to the sun, an unseen influence whose return coincides with upheaval. While evidence remains debated, the persistence of this idea across cultures is difficult to ignore. Something in the sky was remembered as disruptive, periodic, and consequential. Ancient texts speak cautiously of such events. They describe times when the heavens changed, when stars behaved strangely, when the sky itself seemed to move. These descriptions are rare and restrained, suggesting that such knowledge was not shared casually. It was dangerous to misinterpret. The older world, if it existed, may have structured its survival strategies around these long cycles. Collapse would not be random. It would be expected. The role of civilization would be to endure between returns, preserving enough memory to rebuild afterward. This reframes monuments and alignments as countdowns rather than celebrations. Stone becomes a way to mark time beyond generations, a message not of triumph, but of timing. As Act 4 deepens, the line between myth and astronomy blurs further. Gods associated with the sky become less symbolic and more functional. They govern movement, rhythm, and return. The 6,000-year records do not name these forces explicitly. They gesture. They assume understanding that later readers lack. But the consistency of their patterns suggests that something was being tracked, remembered, and quietly feared. And in this fear, transformed into order and restraint, the possibility of an older, sky-aware world becomes less fantastical and more unsettlingly reasonable. Reasonable does not mean comfortable. The idea that ancient people tracked forces capable of resetting civilization unsettles modern assumptions of control. Yet the 6,000-year records carry this unease calmly, without alarm. Fear, when acknowledged, becomes preparation rather than panic. The ancients did not name every force they observed. Naming gives the illusion of mastery. Instead, they described effects. The sky shifts, waters rise, seasons break their rhythm, civilization responds. This restraint suggests humility before scales larger than human planning. Speculative theories about repeating astronomical influences often return to this humility. Whether through orbital mechanics, solar variability, or cosmic debris, the idea is not that the ancients knew everything, but that they noticed patterns long before tools could explain them. Observation preceded explanation. Survival preceded certainty. The older world, if it existed, may have failed not because it lacked knowledge, but because knowledge alone could not overcome scale. Even preparation has limits. Cycles may be navigable, but not avoidable. The goal was never permanence. It was continuity. This perspective aligns with how ancient societies viewed time itself, not as a resource to be conquered, but as a current to move within. To fight the current was to exhaust oneself. To understand it was to endure longer. The 6,000-year records become quieter here, almost reverent. They do not speculate openly about cosmic causes. They encode them through numbers, through alignments, through stories that feel incomplete unless read alongside the sky. Modern interpretation often struggles with this subtlety. We look for declarations. We look for proof. The ancients offered orientation instead, a way to stand in the world without claiming ownership of it. As Act 4 continues, the search for the older world becomes less about uncovering ruins and more about recovering posture. How did ancient people position themselves in relation to forces they could not stop? The answer seems consistent across cultures and time. They observed carefully. They reduced excess. They preserved memory. And when the cycle turned, they accepted loss without surrendering continuity. In this acceptance lies the most difficult lesson the 6,000-year records offer. That resilience is not built on certainty, but on the willingness to live with rhythms that exceed human desire for control. Control is a modern obsession. The ancient world sought something quieter, placement. To know where one stood within a larger movement mattered more than shaping that movement itself. The 6,000-year records reflect this mindset with remarkable consistency. They do not promise safety, they promise orientation. Interpretations of the older world often falter because they search for advancement where restraint once ruled. We imagine lost technologies, forgotten machines, or impossible feats. Yet the evidence preserved in myth and record points elsewhere. The true inheritance may have been epistemological rather than mechanical, a way of knowing when to stop. In ancient narratives, the greatest failures occur not through ignorance, but through overreach. Noise increases, boundaries blur, the system grows loud. These are the signals that precede collapse. They are subtle, internal, and difficult to correct once ignored. This is why the 6,000-year records emphasize listening over conquest. Speculative theories that focus solely on external catastrophe miss this internal dimension. Cycles may be triggered by celestial events, but vulnerability is human. Two worlds can face the same forces and experience different outcomes, depending on how they are structured when pressure arrives. The older world, if it existed, may have been highly complex, but complexity is not wisdom. The records suggest that wisdom emerged after loss, not before it. What survived into the 6,000-year horizon was distilled understanding, stripped of ambition. This distillation explains the simplicity of surviving systems. Base 60 mathematics, repeating calendars, ritualized labor. These are not primitive constraints. They are stabilizers, chosen because they endure disruption. As Act 4 approaches its final movements, interpretation begins to settle into synthesis. The older world is no longer imagined as a vanished golden age. It becomes a phase in an ongoing process of trial, failure, and learning. The 6,000-year records stand not as proof of superiority, but as evidence of humility learned the hard way. They do not say we were once greater. They suggest we were once quieter. And in that quiet, perhaps, lies the difference between a civilization that merely rises and one that knows how to remain. Remaining is more difficult than rising. Growth carries momentum. Stability requires attention. The 6,000-year records reveal a civilization aware of this distinction, one that had already seen how easily motion can become collapse. Modern theories often ask why advanced knowledge would be lost. The question itself reveals bias. Loss is assumed to be failure. Yet within a cyclical framework, loss can be deliberate. Shedding excess preserves core function. Survival does not require everything to continue, only what is essential. The older world may have discovered this through experience rather than intention. Collapse teaches efficiency brutally. What cannot be carried forward disappears. What remains is light, repeatable, and resilient. This is what we find preserved in ancient systems. Interpretations that focus on missing grandeur overlook this logic. We search for traces of dominance, but the records preserve restraint. The absence of certain technologies may not indicate incapacity, but choice shaped by memory of fragility. Even speculative ideas of lost civilizations often imagine them as technologically superior in modern terms. This projection ignores the values encoded in the 6,000-year records. They do not glorify expansion. They honor balance. This is why ancient texts rarely describe the older world in detail. To do so would invite imitation rather than understanding. Memory is preserved through pattern, not blueprint. The goal is not to rebuild what was, but to avoid repeating how it failed. As Act 4 continues, the conversation shifts from evidence to ethics. How should a civilization behave if it knows cycles are real? How much should it grow? What should it preserve? What should it release? The 6,000-year records answer indirectly. Preserve what aligns. Release what amplifies noise. Accept reduction as part of continuity. These are not dramatic conclusions. They are quiet disciplines, and they suggest that the true danger facing civilizations is not external catastrophe, but the inability to recognize when it is time to stop. Stopping is an act of wisdom only when it is voluntary. Forced stopping arrives as collapse. The 6,000-year records seem written by people who understood this difference intimately. Their restraint feels intentional, shaped by remembrance rather than fear. Modern interpretations struggle with this concept because they assume progress must be defended at all costs. Yet the ancient worldview treated unchecked progress as risk. Movement required counterbalance. Expansion demanded pause. Without these, systems tipped beyond recovery. Speculative theories that propose sudden, overwhelming cataclysms capture only part of the picture. Even if such events occurred, vulnerability was already present. Collapse is rarely the result of a single cause. It is the convergence of pressure and fragility. The older world, if it existed, may have reached a point where stopping was no longer possible. Systems had grown too interconnected. Reduction would have required coordination beyond capacity. When correction came, it was total. This possibility casts the 6,000-year records in a new light. They may represent the first civilization to consciously limit itself, a deliberate narrowing after loss, a world designed to survive rather than dominate. The emphasis on law, ritual, and repetition becomes clearer. These are braking mechanisms. They slow change. They preserve alignment. They frustrate innovation not because it is evil, but because it is destabilizing. As Act 4 nears its end, interpretation yields a sobering insight. The older world may not have been destroyed by ignorance or barbarism, but by success without restraint. This insight does not accuse the past. It instructs the present. The records do not ask us to reject progress. They ask us to understand its cost. And in this understanding, the older world ceases to be a mystery buried in time. It becomes a warning etched into the structure of civilization itself, waiting for each generation to decide whether it will listen. Listening is never passive. It is an active state of attention that must be sustained long before danger becomes visible, long before the river rises, long before the harvest fails, long before a city learns to fear its own crowded streets. The 6,000-year records seem shaped by people who understood this with a kind of quiet clarity that feels almost unfamiliar to modern minds. They did not wait for collapse to change their behavior. They practiced restraint while the world still looked stable, when caution would have felt unnecessary, when memory could be dismissed as superstition or pessimism. In the oldest layers of tradition, catastrophe is not something that arrives as a surprise from outside. It grows from within a system that has begun to drift. The drift is subtle at first. A calendar slips by a day and no one corrects it. Measurements vary slightly from one city to the next. Rituals are shortened, not out of rebellion, but out of convenience. The pace of life quickens, and the pauses that once carried meaning become interruptions to be eliminated. None of this looks like disaster. It looks like efficiency. It looks like progress. It looks like success. But the ancient posture preserved in those early records suggests another way of seeing. It implies that the true moment of failure is rarely the flood, the fire, or the darkness that follows. The true moment of failure is earlier, quieter, and harder to name. It is the moment when listening stops, when a society becomes too loud to hear its own imbalance, when complexity grows faster than care, when systems become so interconnected that no one can see the whole and no one feels responsible for the strain accumulating beneath the surface. Modern minds often search the ancient record for prediction, dates, schedules, warnings written plainly, as if the past owed us certainty. Yet the older perspective appears different. It was not built on the fantasy of control. It did not assume that knowledge could prevent every ending. It assumed endings were part of the rhythm, and that the highest skill was learning how to meet them without losing everything that made life coherent. Their attention was less about foretelling the exact event and more about recognizing saturation, when growth had outpaced coherence, when abundance had become noise, when the pace of change had exceeded the capacity of tradition to stabilize it. This sensitivity to timing is difficult to recover today because it offers no immediate reward. It asks for slowing down in cultures that praise acceleration. It asks for limits in systems designed around expansion. It asks for deliberate pauses when everything around us insists that stopping is failure. The 6,000-year records do not tell us how to enforce this discipline, because perhaps discipline was not enforced at all. It was shared. It was woven into daily life until it felt natural. It was taught through repetition, reinforced through ritual, and protected by the simple understanding that forgetting had already cost too much. If an older world existed before ours, then its disappearance may have left behind the most sobering inheritance imaginable. Not a blueprint for lost machines, not a list of vanished cities, but a lesson about fragility. That civilizations do not collapse only because of external forces, but because they become internally misaligned at the very moment they feel most confident. That scale can become a vulnerability. That complexity can become a trap. That progress without pause can become a kind of blindness. From this angle, the purpose of preserving memory changes. Memory is not kept to glorify the past. It is kept to seed the future. The records begin to resemble emergency tools, not trophies. They carry what can be carried: rhythms, measurements, alignments, the essential idea that balance must be maintained or it will be restored by force. Preparation, in this sense, does not prevent an ending. It shapes what survives it. It determines whether the next world begins with total amnesia or with at least a few reliable fragments to rebuild from. This is why the oldest records feel composed rather than celebratory. They do not sing about beginnings. They record continuity. They speak from a world that has already narrowed its expectations, a world that has already learned that the horizon can shrink overnight. They remind us without bitterness that reduction can be chosen or imposed, and that there is a profound difference between the two. As this act draws toward its close, interpretation becomes less important than recognition. The older world does not need to be proven in every detail to matter. Its lesson is already visible in the repeating pattern of history, in the way every civilization eventually reaches a point where it can no longer hear itself. The ancient message is not loud. It does not accuse. It simply waits, like a tablet in the sand, like a stone aligned to a returning sun. And perhaps the most unsettling thought is also the most calming, that the last meaningful choice a civilization ever has is not the choice to escape cycles, but the choice to notice the drift early enough to change its posture, to become quiet again, to listen again, to remember not everything, but enough. Inheritance rarely announces itself. It does not arrive as a clear memory passed from one generation to the next, neatly explained and carefully labeled. Instead, it moves quietly beneath awareness, shaping instincts, fears, and intuitions long before they become beliefs. The 6,000-year record suggests that humanity carries more than stories from the past. It carries behavioral echoes formed by long cycles of collapse and recovery, impressions left by worlds that ended before memory learned how to describe them. Across cultures separated by oceans, languages, and millennia, the same unease appears. A sense that history is layered rather than linear, that progress is provisional, that something essential once existed and slipped away, leaving behind only fragments and longing. This feeling does not require direct transmission. It emerges naturally in a species that has survived interruption more than once. The older world, whether it was a single advanced civilization or a series of forgotten phases, becomes less important than the pattern it left behind. Humanity adapts not only to climate and terrain, but to expectation. We build with the awareness, however faint, that structures can fall. We tell stories about endings and rebirths. We imagine futures shaped by resets, even when we describe them as fantasies or fears. These habits suggest memory without detail, recognition without explanation. This inherited awareness may explain why apocalyptic thinking appears so persistently across human cultures. It is often dismissed as pessimism or superstition, yet it may be something more fundamental. Not fear of the unknown, but familiarity with loss. A deep intuition that stability is temporary and that systems can vanish faster than belief allows. The 6,000-year records did not invent this intuition. They captured it at a moment when it was still articulate, when people still understood why caution mattered. Later generations felt the same instinct, but struggled to name it. Myth, religion, philosophy, and eventually science all attempted to fill the same absence left by forgotten experience. Even today, this inheritance surfaces in subtle ways, in our discomfort when systems grow too complex to understand, in our anxiety when growth accelerates beyond control, in our recurring desire to simplify, to return to something smaller and more manageable when the world feels overwhelmed. These impulses are not regressions, they are echoes. The older world, viewed through this lens, does not haunt us as a lost golden age. It accompanies us as a shadow memory, influencing choices without revealing its face. It shapes the questions we ask when standing among ruins or beneath unfamiliar stars. Have we been here before? Have we done this already? What did we forget? This is why the ancient records feel so restrained. They do not dramatize loss. They do not describe the older world in detail. To do so would invite imitation rather than understanding. Memory preserved as pattern is more durable than memory preserved as instruction. What matters is not recreating what was, but recognizing when the same conditions return. As Act 4 gives way fully to reflection, interpretation softens into resonance. The older world no longer needs to be proven to exist materially to exert influence. It lives in the way civilizations hesitate at certain thresholds, in the way we sense danger when speed outpaces care, in the quiet suspicion that progress without limits carries a hidden cost. The 6,000-year records offer no command. They do not claim authority. They simply acknowledge what has already happened more than once, that humanity's greatest challenge is not the loss of knowledge, but the loss of awareness, not forgetting facts, but forgetting patterns. And in that forgetting, the cycle tightens again, until awareness returns, not as certainty, but as intuition, not as proof, but as posture, waiting patiently, as it always has, for those willing to listen beneath the noise of their own success. Posture is revealed not in moments of crisis, but in how a civilization behaves when it feels safe. The 6,000-year records imply that the true test of continuity occurs during stability, when urgency fades and the need for memory seems abstract. It is in these periods of apparent calm that forgetting begins its quiet work. Ancient societies that carried the weight of earlier endings treated stability with caution. Prosperity was not a signal to accelerate, but a reminder to reinforce balance. Lineages were recorded carefully. Calendars were reset with precision. Names were repeated across generations, not out of vanity, but to maintain continuity. These acts may appear small, even mundane, yet they were deliberate strategies against erasure. In this context, memory was not romantic. It was practical. It was not about honoring ancestors for their greatness, but about acknowledging their fragility. The past was consulted not for inspiration, but for restraint. This is why early records rarely celebrate expansion. They document boundaries, measurements, limits. As time passed and the older world slipped further into obscurity, these practices persisted even as their original reasoning faded. Repetition remained, but meaning thinned. Rituals continued because they had always been done, not because they were still understood. Yet even stripped of context, they retained stabilizing power. Pattern can endure longer than explanation. The 6,000-year records preserve the last moment, when these patterns were still consciously linked to survival. Afterward, continuity became habit rather than intention. Memory survived, but awareness weakened. This distinction marks the transition from deliberate stewardship to unconscious inheritance. What is striking is how deeply this inheritance still shapes human behavior. Even in modern societies, we sense that something is lost when traditions dissolve too quickly. We feel unmoored when time accelerates beyond comprehension. We search instinctively for rhythms, for cycles, for structures that slow the rush forward. These instincts are not nostalgic, they are ancient. The older world, if it existed, may have discovered that continuity requires repetition precisely because novelty cannot survive disruption. Innovation dazzles, but it fractures easily. Repetition feels dull, but it carries memory through collapse. This logic explains why so much ancient knowledge appears conservative, even restrictive. It was designed to endure, not to impress. As Act 5 unfolds, reflection replaces investigation. The question is no longer whether an older world existed, but how its shadow continues to influence choices made thousands of years later. The answer seems to lie not in ruins or texts alone, but in human hesitation itself, in the pause before overreach, in the discomfort that arises when growth feels unsustainable. The 6,000-year records do not resolve this tension. They hold it. They demonstrate that awareness does not eliminate cycles, but it can change how a civilization passes through them. Endings become less catastrophic when memory remains active. And perhaps this is the quiet promise carried forward, that even when worlds end, something gentler than destruction can survive. A posture, a rhythm, a way of moving through time without demanding that it stop. Certainty is often the final illusion before change. When a civilization believes it has understood the world completely, when its systems feel permanent and its explanations feel sufficient, it stops listening. The 6,000-year records seem to speak from the far side of that illusion. They are calm not because the world was safe, but because certainty had already failed. In the quiet aftermath preserved in these texts, there is no triumphal tone, no declaration of victory over chaos. Life resumes in a reduced register. People plant again. They measure land again. They rebuild with care rather than ambition. What is striking is not despair, but steadiness. The knowledge that what is created may not last does not paralyze action. It refines it. This posture is difficult for modern minds to inhabit. We are trained to equate meaning with permanence, to believe that what does not endure has somehow failed. Yet the ancient worldview embedded in the records suggests the opposite. That meaning is carried by continuity, not longevity. A thing does not need to last forever to matter. It needs to transmit something essential forward. Modesty, in this sense, becomes strength. The older world's survivors appear to have understood that living without expectation of permanence frees a civilization from panic. When collapse is possible, preparation replaces denial. When loss is imaginable, excess loses its appeal. The future becomes something to seed, not to conquer. This may be why the ancient record feels so restrained. There is no obsession with final outcomes, no promise of ultimate resolution. Instead, there is an emphasis on alignment, on being in the right place at the right time, doing what can be done while it can be done. This orientation allows life to continue even as conditions change. As modern societies confront instability of their own making, this ancient posture begins to feel unexpectedly familiar. The desire to slow down, to simplify, to step back from systems that have grown too vast to comprehend. These impulses are often dismissed as regression, yet they echo a much older intelligence, one shaped by experience rather than optimism. The 6,000-year records do not offer comfort in the sense of reassurance. They offer grounding. They remind us that instability is not a flaw in history, but a feature of it. That civilizations rise and fall not because they are uniquely broken, but because change is woven into time itself. As this narrative approaches its final movement, the older world dissolves fully into pattern. It no longer needs to be imagined as a specific place or culture. It exists as recurrence, as rhythm, as the quiet understanding that nothing human is exempt from transformation. And perhaps this is the final gift hidden in those ancient records. Not proof of what once was, but permission to live without the burden of finality, to act with care rather than certainty, to understand that stability is something practiced, not possessed, and that even as the ground shifts, meaning can remain, carried gently forward by those who choose to listen rather than rush. Time, when observed closely, does not behave as a straight path moving cleanly from past to future. It folds back on itself, overlaps, repeats, and leaves impressions that remain long after their origin is forgotten. The 6,000-year records sit inside one of these folds, preserving a moment when humanity still sensed both directions at once. They look backward toward loss and forward toward uncertainty, without believing either could be escaped. What these records ultimately reveal is not a single forgotten civilization, nor a secret history waiting to overturn everything we know. They reveal a recurring human condition. Awareness rises. Systems grow more complex. Stability creates confidence. Confidence dulls attention. Balance strains. Memory thins. Collapse resets the field. From the quiet that follows, life resumes, shaped by whatever fragments remain intact enough to guide rebuilding. Seen this way, the older world becomes less a place and more a phase, a stage in a repeating process that does not belong to one culture, one era, or one geography. It belongs to humanity itself. The same pattern appears whether we look at ancient Mesopotamia, dynastic Egypt, the Maya lowlands, or later empires whose ruins still dominate landscapes. Different names, different symbols, the same rhythm. This perspective does not diminish human effort. It reframes it. Building, teaching, recording, and remembering are no longer attempts to defy time. They become acts of participation within it. Meaning is not measured by how long something stands, but by how effectively it carries coherence forward when conditions change. The older world, whatever form it took, participates in this continuity. Its influence is present not only in artifacts and myths, but in the recurring intuition that history is deeper than it appears. That progress carries a shadow, that something essential always seems just out of reach. Not because it was lost accidentally, but because no single age can hold the whole of it. This is why the mystery persists, not because evidence is lacking, but because the truth it points toward resists final framing. The 6,000-year records do not resolve the question of origins. They soften it. They suggest that looking for a single beginning may be the wrong approach entirely. As listeners, we are not asked to solve the past. We are asked to hold it gently, without forcing it into certainty, to allow the possibility that humanity's story is older, wider, and quieter than we were taught. That civilization has ended before, not as failure, but as transition. In this light, the records do not conclude with answers. They end with openness, an invitation to observe patterns without rushing to dominate them, to notice how often the same tensions reappear, dressed in new language but driven by the same underlying forces. And as this understanding settles, something subtle shifts. The anxiety of final outcomes loosens. The pressure to be unique dissolves. We recognize ourselves not as the climax of history, but as one moment within a long sequence of attempts to live with balance under changing skies. The 6,000-year records remain where they have always been, quiet, patient, uninsistent. They do not demand belief. They offer recognition, a calm reminder that humanity has been shaped by cycles it did not begin and will not end, yet remains capable in every age of carrying memory forward with care rather than noise. Care is the final measure of continuity, not control, not dominance. Care. The 6,000-year records endure because someone long ago believed the future mattered even when the present felt uncertain. Clay was pressed into shape. Stone was aligned with patience. Memory was moved outside the human mind and anchored in material that could survive fire, water, and forgetting. These were not acts of confidence. They were acts of humility. In this way, the older world does not truly end. It dissolves into inheritance. It becomes the reason humanity keeps asking the same questions when standing among ruins or beneath unfamiliar stars. Were we here before? Have we done this already? What did we forget? These questions are not signs of confusion. They are signs of continuity still alive beneath disruption. A species that has truly forgotten does not wonder. It only repeats. The calm tone of the ancient records now feels intentional. Panic does not preserve. Urgency fades quickly. Only what is shaped with patience survives long enough to be rediscovered. The scribes seem to understand this instinctively. Their words do not shout across time. They wait. They assume that if someone is ready to listen, the message will still be there. This patience reframes the entire story. The older world may never be fully recovered, and perhaps it was never meant to be. Its purpose was not to be rebuilt in detail, but to be remembered just enough to guide restraint, to remind future civilizations that excess has consequences, that balance is fragile, and that reduction is not the same as failure. From this perspective, endings lose their terror. They become passages, thresholds between forms rather than absolute erasures. What matters is not how long a civilization lasts, but what it leaves behind when it can no longer continue. Does it leave noise, or does it leave something usable, something quiet enough to endure? Tonight, as the weight of time settles gently, there is no demand to decide what is true in a final sense. The 6,000-year records do not ask for belief. They ask for attention. They invite us to notice patterns in our own moment, the speed, the scale, the strain, the subtle feeling that systems are growing louder than the care required to sustain them. If there is peace in this understanding, it comes from release, from knowing that we are not required to solve history or escape cycles. We are only asked to participate consciously while we are here, to carry memory forward without insisting that it save everything. The world has been old before. It will be old again. Between these moments, humanity moves carefully or forgetfully, sometimes leaving behind wisdom, sometimes leaving behind rubble. The difference is not knowledge, it is posture. And so the story closes not with an ending, but with a pause, a breath held between cycles. Somewhere beneath the noise of the present, memory continues its quiet work, waiting, patient, ready to be recognized again by those who choose to listen slowly, gently, and without the need for certainty.